Welkom terug. We keren allemaal nu langzaam terug naar de sessie. Vanuit de sessie naar de stage. Voordat we verder gaan, eerst straks met een korte terugblik op de sessies, hebben we een muzikaal intermezzo. We mochten vanmorgen al meegenieten met de prachtige muziek van Ruji. En dit keer weer welkom Ruji om ons mee te nemen op jouw muzikale reis. Dank.
Ja, nummer wat ik nu ga doen is in mijn moedertaal, Kinyarwanda. En het nummer heet Sina. Dat betekent ik zou niet. Dit nummer gaat het over datgene wat ik allemaal meegemaakt heb. Het goede en het slechte. Neem ik altijd wel mee omdat het maakt wie ik ben. En ik haal daar levenslessen uit. Dus het is ook een boodschap aan diegenen die ook in deze tijden, we weten in de tijden die wij zijn, en dat je dat probeer wel te kijken van wat je meeneemt. Want het kan je altijd wel ten dienst staan in het vervolg. Ik heb het dus over wat ik meegemaakt heb. Dit nummer heb ik geschreven daarover. En als ik terugkijk naar mijn leven, dan probeer ik altijd van het goede en van het slechte dingen mee te maken die mij verder kunnen helpen. Dus Sina gaat daarover. Het betekent, ik zou niet vergeten, ik zou niet verloochenen en ik zou niet ontkennen. Ik neem het mee. Kamenyana karere atoreyemo nabonye ninjye nyine wamenye ibyo nanyuzemo nshaka kuba nk'abandi nkifuza ko twese twasa nshaka gushimisha abandi njye ngasigara n'ubusa amazi arashyuha ntiyibagirwa iwabo wa mbeho sinzigera nibagirwa wambeshejeho sinabyibagirwa sinabihakana impanuka ingaruka byose nanyuzemo sinabyibagirwa sinabihakana kuwampashije kuwankomeje kuwabimbanyemo wobu Sina, wobu, Sina, wobu, Sina, wobu, Sina, wobu, Sina, wobu, Sina, wobu, Sina, wobu. Rwarango ndembe, Sina, rekanga marira tembe, rekanga renga inkombe. Jibambe reka ibitekerezo byongera ibigeragezo kwitesha ihozo Sina rwarango ndembe riranga amarira atembe reka ngarenga inkombe kwitesha ibambe reka ibitekerezo byongera ibigeragezo kwitesha ihozo sinabihakana impanuka ingaruka byose nanyuzemo sinabyibagirwa sinabihakana kuwampashije kuwankomeje kuwabimbanyemo wobu Sina 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 wobu Sina. Oh.
Wauw.
Thank you. Thank you.
Nou, we zitten hier met kippenvel aan tafel. Dankjewel, Ruji, voor dit prachtige nummer.
Graag gedaan,
Sina.
dank jullie wel ook.
En Instagram.
Yes.
Vind hem. Prachtig. Eigenlijk moeten we doorzingen met elkaar. Maar voordat we verder gaan met het middagprogramma, willen we natuurlijk ook nog even terugkijken op de sessies. Jullie kunnen de Mentimeter link op de website zien. En dan willen we graag jullie vragen om antwoord te geven op 2 vragen. Omdat we willen kijken hoe jullie de deelsessies vonden. Vraag 1 is, geef in een woord weer, en dat is natuurlijk heel moeilijk. Geef in een woord weer wat u vond van de sessie die u zojuist heeft bijgewoond. En de tweede is, geef in een woord weer wat u heeft geleerd tijdens de deelsessie die u zojuist heeft bijgewoond. We zijn heel benieuwd. Dus vraag 1, geef in een woord weer wat u vond van de sessie. En dan vraag 2, geef in een woord weer wat u heeft geleerd. Dan gaan we even kijken wat er allemaal uit gaat komen. We zijn denk ik nog aan het zoeken. Het is altijd even heen en weer klikken. Inspireren, nou dat begint al heel goed. Bij beide. Geef in 1 woord weer wat u vond van de sessie die u zojuist heeft bijgewoond. Inspirerend is de eerste. En misschien dat meerdere die hebben ingetikt, want die blijft staan. Inspiring, hope. Oh, dit geeft een goede aanzet voor ons gesprek straks, gasten. Eerlijk, indrukwekkend, vernieuwend, interessant. Ja, transparant, ook ontzettend belangrijk. Dit zijn wel echt goede feedback. Ik hoop dat u dit ook kunt zien thuis. Inspirerend blijft heel groot, hè? Dus dat blijft een... En dit hebben we zo nodig in deze tijden. Inspiratie om verder met vernieuwing en zelfreflectie te gaan. Educatief. Ik moet zeggen dat ik een aantal dingen niet meer kan lezen op deze afstand. En toe ben aan een nieuwe bril, blijkbaar. Dus Niek, misschien als jij nog iets ziet wat verbindend, zie ik. Ja, die zocht ik. Nou.
Ongemak?
Herkenbaar.
Ongemak, mooi. Zie, die had niet. Dit begint nu wat kleiner te worden.
Zelfreflectie.
Herkenbaar, ja, zie ik ook. Kwetsbaarheid. En ongemak, juist daar leren we van. Die ruimte in te gaan van ongemak.
Topstudenten staat er ook.
Ja, I'm lost. Sorry, ik kan een aantal dingen nog zien, maar misschien dat...
Ja, kwetsbaarheid. Misschien had iemand die al gezegd, maar die vond ik ook wel mooi.
Heel mooi.
Ja.
Ja, en ik vind het interessant omdat kwetsbaarheid en ongemak heel erg aan elkaar raken. En ik vind kwetsbaarheid dan veel fijner. Niet dat je ongemak... Kwetsbaar is ongemak, maar kwetsbaar zit ook moed in. Ja. Oké, geef in 1 woord weer. Dit was heel mooi, dus ik ben echt heel benieuwd wat er nu uit gaat komen. Geef in 1 woord weer wat u heeft geleerd in de deelsessie. Dus geleerd. Dus we hebben net een indruk gekregen van de deelsessies. Geleerd over de beleving van student. Meer bewustzijn nodig. Dat er meer bewustzijn nodig is, denk ik. Dat er dan wordt bedoeld misschien. Mooi ook, zelfonderzoek, ja. Dat is mooi als je dat kunt leren. Spannend. Dat het spannend is. Dat doorzettingsvermogen nodig is. Ja, het is niet 1 training, 1 sessie, 1... Het is een lange adem, hard werken, ontleren. Storytelling zie ik. Belevingsstudent, heel mooi. Meer over whiteness. Building bridges. Samenwerking zoeken. Ja, we kunnen het niet alleen. Studentparticipatie, absoluut. Storytelling. Wat is er veel geleerd tijdens die sessies? Draagvlak is ongelooflijk belangrijk. Klein beginnen. Ja, klein beginnen en groot...
Input.
Wat zeg je?
Concrete input.
Concrete input. Dankjewel. Dit is heel klein voor mij nu. Ja, dank.
Ja, volgens mij ook een mooie is evaluatie. Want ik denk dat we dat vaak ook wel vergeten. Hè? Van wat gebeurt er nou eigenlijk met alles wat we doen? Wat heeft het voor effect?
Ja. En dan ook evaluatie vanuit wiens perspectief.
Ook.
Ja, dat is heel belangrijk. Nou, dank. Prachtig. Die Mentimeters die worden opgeslagen en later ook gedeeld. Nou, dit geeft al een hele mooie aanzet tot het panelgesprek. I'm going to now switch to English. So, of course, all sessions have been recorded, so you can always watch them back. And I'm sure many of you might have been inspired now by reading these Mentimeters, these reflections, and might go back to watch the other sessions. But not yet. Please stay with us, because we have a very exciting session with really inspiring. And so we were talking about inspiration. I already had a preparatory meeting with all of you, and it was absolutely inspiring. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you. So first of all, Riziana Goliman, welcome.
Thank you.
You're a student at the Hague University of Applied Sciences and the University of Leiden.
Yes.
So you're we call that a student squared. So you're. So I kind of, my math just kind of stayed at the MAVO level. So, but I know that there's something with squared, and then it's even multiplied. So you're a student in more than one sense at two institutions, but also in multiple ways. Because I'm now 2.5 months on at the Hague University of Applied Sciences myself, and I already have weekly meetings with you, and I've learned already so much from you. So you are. So this is already impressive, but you're also founder of Build the Table.
Yes.
That's not everything yet. I think we can just finish this session just by running down your list. You're the winner of the ECHO Award, HBO 2020, and you're an advisor at the Ministry of Education on Diversity Matters, and you've been very much involved in Black Lives Matter protests in June, May and June last year, 2020.
And yesterday.
And yesterday, exactly. We need to, of course, name these. Yesterday was a very important demonstration. And probably we'll also come back to that. On my other side is Victoria Magna. And I've also had the honor to work with you last year. You're an alumni from the Institute of Social Studies. Yes. You graduated with distinction. I have to, at some point I was like, I cannot teach you anything anymore. You're teaching me. You're a staunch anti-racist activist. You're absolutely brilliant researcher, a movement builder in the Netherlands, in Nigeria, and across, because there's something coming that will join all the continents together. Yes. So watch this space. And then Niek, it's becoming better and better, this introduction. Niek Putman, project leader, social impact at the Sessie Community Center at the Hogeschool van Amsterdam, which stands for Student Engagement and Social Impact. And since recent, you're also a teacher. So you're also in the university, but not off the university. I think that was, and your work is very much informed by anti-racism and anti-oppressive pedagogies. And then Isminta, a former or still continuing colleague, friend, inspirational researcher. You're a research associate at the Free University of Amsterdam. Your research is on belonging, which is a theme that I really is close to my heart, not in the way that it's used often in policy, but how it's used in how people draw boundaries between each other. So I think that's a very interesting research you're part of. You're also part of the diversity and inclusion work at the Free University of Amsterdam, and you're engaged in broadening conversations and actions on anti-racism, including students with non-migrant backgrounds. And that, for me, was a very refreshing sentence. So welcome all of you here.
Thank you.
To go into it right away, we have decided we are done with the discussions about terminologies. So we want, and you've granted me permission to present some of these terms so that at least we start the conversation based on a particular understanding of terms. Yes. And we don't have to go back there. And everyone who would not be able to, then there's a lot of reading. So I also there's a website that I will refer to by ECHO, where people can also do some more learning, because learning is important and something that you can do collectively, but also on your own. So there are some really brilliant resources online. So the first term, and that's the term that we're discussing today mostly, is institutional racism. And many people have misunderstandings about it. It refers to the ways in which ideas of white superiority are captured in everyday thinking and are embedded in institutional policies and practices. So, of course, there's some nuance lost always in these very brief definitions. So at least we have a starting ground from which we can speak and use these terms here at the table. And I think we came up with some really concise definitions together. If we talk about anti-black racism, we say it refers to policies and practices rooted in institutions such as education, healthcare, which is very prominent these days, and of course justice, always on the front of our minds, that mirror and reinforce beliefs, attitudes, prejudice, stereotyping and oppression of people of Black African descent. Then we talk about individual racism, because there's always a danger for conflation between individual and institutional racism. And we wanted to avoid that, especially in how the conversation is received, refers to the beliefs, attitudes and or actions of individuals that support or perpetuate racism, both deliberately and unintentionally. And I think that last bit is really important. It's about the effect of our speech and acts and not about the intention.
Exactly.
So that defense is off the table. You're building the table, so it's off the table. Yeah. So discrimination is not racism. I think that was one of our main points as well. The unequal treatment, it refers to the unequal treatment of members of various groups based on race. So it can be but it's not the same. So they cannot be equated. There are different mechanisms and different power dynamics at play. Can also be on gender, on social class, sexual orientation, physical ability, religion, and other categories. And Dr. Sharon Stewart has really brilliantly explained the intersectionality of all these different structures. So we don't have to go into it. We can actually build on her groundwork in that. Then the last bit, and I think this is really important for our work, and especially your work, anti-racism. Anti-racism refers to the deliberate act to dismantle racist power structures and practices that are informed by whiteness and white superiority, and is different from non-racism, which still perpetuates racism as a system in society. And then the most important bit, and I think this is something that you've all had to face last year, is that there are different understandings of Black Lives Matter as a movement. So the history is vast, and their own website, the Black Lives Matter website, is definitely a site to go to for more information. But it was started in July 2013 by 3 women, 2 who identify as queer. The hashtag was started, Black Lives Matter hashtag started after the killer of Trayvon Martin was acquitted, and Trayvon Martin, of course, was killed 17 months prior to this date. So this movement is already years and years happening, and also it rapidly grew into a decentralized global movement. It has, I wouldn't say chapters, but it has groups in Brazil, it has groups in South Africa, in East Africa, and here in the Netherlands it has been collaborating with Kick Out Zwarte Piet and the Black Archives for years already. So it's not, for some, it felt maybe as if it came up last year in May, June, but of course it has a very deep history. So if you would like to go and have a look at more of these terminologies and more resources, the Learning and Teaching website by ECHO has lots of resources that can help you further in this. But for now, let's continue our discussion, because the protests of last year, May, June, the Black Lives Matter protests that are part of the bigger movement. Of course, they happened globally, but they also happened here in the Netherlands. And all of you, in one or the other way, were involved in it. And they created a momentum in your work, so to speak. The challenge now is to keep this momentum going, or to rekindle the momentum for some of you. I know. And work towards institutionalizing anti-racist pedagogy in higher education. That's your main challenge. That's our main challenge, everyone that's part of this anti-racist work. The question that we prepared to discuss today is, could you briefly first reflect on this momentum, what it meant for your work? And then also think about and reflect together on what the barriers are to keeping this momentum going. What is holding you back from the institution? What's holding you back in other ways in the work that you're doing? So, Niek, I would like to start with you.
Yes, thank you. For us as SACI, so sometimes I'm going to speak as us because we do the work together, so I don't want to take credit for everything that we do. But we have talked about race and racism and color and the role of color in an institute. For years. For example, we organized Dear White HVA, where we talked about institutional racism at the institute. But we've always been, how do you say it? We went to the people to talk about it. We did programs, and always the reaction was always, no, let's not talk about racism. Let's not talk about race. Let's talk about diversity. Let's talk about we're all special. Not special, but like we have to talk about everybody. And we were like, yeah, but there are certain problems, institutional problems, that come with being a person of color. And then in March, with the momentum of the Black Lives Matter protest. Is it March or is it May?
That was May.
Yeah, sorry, I was
right.
I was confused, but I
March
heard
is
myself
Corona.
saying March, and I was like, it was not March. Then it was the first time people came to us to talk about race, to talk about racism, to talk about the experience of students of color, of students that feel excluded of education, that don't feel seen, that don't feel like they're seen for all what they are and only seen for their color or their position. And it was a momentum that we wrote a letter with each other, and we wrote a letter for all the teachers that wanted to do something. So we heard a lot of, we want to do something for the students of color. Like we feel like there needs to be a change, and we wanted to write a letter that the change is within. So they have to start look at themselves and look at the role they take in the conversation when it's about race. So. That you have to listen, that you have to decentralize. So there went my English, but to decenter themselves from the conversation and listen to people of color, what they need, but also not make them responsible for your own knowledge. So in that letter, we gave a lot of books, articles, TED Talks, documentaries, studies that they can look into, and and also that it is, how do you say it? Ongemakkelijk. Uncomfortable, but it's not really uncomfortable. It's more the uncomfortable within yourself, and you have to get. You have to research that. What is that? And then go in the conversation. So for us, that was a good moment, because also after that letter, we went kind of viral within the institute, and a lot of faculties and docents came to us. So also people at higher positions came to us to ask us advice. How did we do that for all those years? What's important? So. Yeah, that was nice for the momentum to say.
So you felt listened to for the first time, instead of that you had to approach people and knock on their doors and listen to it. Suddenly, you felt that they welcomed you and really started to listen. And what happened? How was that momentum then? Because this was May, June. Yeah. And how is it going now? And what came of it? That kind of reflection and talking and discussion. Is there any tangible change happening at the HVA?
Oh, that's how can I say this? It it is a lot of conversation. So for me, as a person that wants to see change, it doesn't feel there has happened a lot. We're around a lot of tables, talking a lot about what needs to happen, to talk about all the pros and the cons and the don'ts. Cons maybe not a good word to say, but the don'ts. So the really change. So to institutionalize anti-racism, to institutionalize the organizations that fight for the people of color for years, and where is a lot of knowledge. I don't see happening that it's institutionalized right now. They're wanting to do that, but they're also afraid that if they do it, they show color. So they're not like this objective, neutral organization, and I feel that's the biggest fear of the HVA right now, or maybe a lot of institutes.
Because they then have to admit what the dominant powers are at play, and you feel that that's holding back that recognition, and therefore from talking to action. But then the space of SACI at least has become more institutionalized, you would say, or is it still?
No.
Okay, this is a very good point, and we'll come back to that. So Victoria, I know that you've had your share of challenges, but before going into that, because I'm sure when Nick starts talking, you go like, yes, this is all. But before that, something happened also. There was a momentum in May when you were a student at ISS, and that also compelled you to act. So could you maybe reflect on that, and then also maybe on the barriers that you're meeting to keep this momentum going or rekindle the momentum?
Okay, thank you, Naomi. I would first say that when the Black Lives Matter graced our doorsteps in the Netherlands, two things happened for me, which were the foundation of my work on students' voices. The first thing was introduction to new pedagogy, new ways of teaching and learning by a few teachers at the ISS. And the second was a teacher reaching out to me and a couple of my colleagues and friends to contribute to a statement. This time around, what was different about the statement was the fact that we were not being called to educate anybody. We were being called to react on paper. We were being called to express how we felt, with the reactions going back and forth. We were being called to reflect upon the BLM at the time. And that was interesting because for the first time we were seen.
Yeah.
Now, these experiences resonated with my consciousness that there are unequal binaries in knowledge production because we were in school at the time, So I could relate at this point. When I was called to reflect, then for the first time, I was able to conceptualize how I felt of the institutionally preconditioned minorities, or as an institutionally preconditioned minority in knowledge production. And this wasn't just a me thing, right? There were other people who reflected on the same, And so at some point, there had to be a convergence. While the statement, the beauty about the statement, it wasn't one statement. It was 4 or 5 lines by A, 4 or 5 lines by B, 6, 7 lines by C. Just express it as you feel it. And it was published by the ISS at the time.
Yep.
And a lot of people reached out to us, some who didn't realize that we felt that way, right? Some people even apologized.
That you felt essentialized.
Yes.
Based on race.
Yes.
Because that's how you would like to fertilize it, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
And so much later, or in between all of that, I started pondering, and I started expecting more, But the same people were the ones reaching out. The same suspects were the ones reaching out. And I asked myself, if this isn't going to be a collaborative journey for every one of us, are we not afraid that we are getting to a time or to a pitfall that sees each and every one of us learning nothing new and producing knowledge that is not worth learning. And at this time, the ISS then commissioned the research on students' voices, because if the few of us could say all that we did in that statement, then there is more, right? Yep. So the ISS decided to do that. But speaking of the challenges, we saw deflections and assumptions. And this meant substituting racism for discrimination without more.
So exactly what you're saying, not talking about the specific problem and the specific experiences by students. Yeah. And therefore it became diluted. Yeah,
so it was, it also saw abdication of responsibilities, institutional responsibilities to individuals. And so it was pegged to faces, The word was romanticized, in such a way that it whittled down the core of our experiences.
And which word was romanticized?
Racism was romanticized, or is romanticized, So people begin to speak of politically correct ways of expressing yourself without offending sensitivities.
That meant you also had to adjust your language.
Yes. This is the way I would like to express myself, but then somebody else is saying, no, I think you should express yourself in this manner because it's more, it goes in line with what we're already talking about. But unfortunately, it reproduced the same institution that we were trying to fight. And I also saw a lot of standing on the fence. You're neither here nor there, which resonates with one of the definitions, Non-racism actually reproduces racism.
So-called neutrality is something that also you mentioned.
Exactly. Yes. We also saw institutions appearing to speak of decolonization, but preaching reverse racism.
Yeah, that's so we already established that's actually not possible.
Yeah.
So that's and that the reason why we actually wanted to put it out there is because we're not having that discussion because
it's impossible.
It's one based on
but it's a barrier.
Yeah, it's definitely a barrier because still people hold it on as a defense to really engage and be honest and uncomfortable.
Exactly. Just quickly,
please.
I also saw a situation where we preached diversity as a buzzword, truly as a buzzword, right? And enjoying the rich blend of internationalization without the corresponding obligation that comes with it. And I perceived a mixed reaction between different people. A section thought this was an opportunity for change, but another thought it was a reminder of a revolution that would take away privileges that they enjoy. And of course, when people think you're here to take away their privileges to upturn the status quo rather than create balance, then it becomes a huge barrier for your work. So, yeah.
And you think diversity was weaponized in that way?
Yes.
And I'm sorry maybe to use a very, very sharp word, but I also sense when you were talking, Nick, diversity has been deployed in ways that it moves away from actually the struggle that's at hand. And I think this really ties to your experiences. Riciane, could you tell a bit more about the momentum, May and June? Because we keep going back there, but then I know you have so much to say, and then reflect on these barriers.
Yes.
But actually, you're starting with the barrier.
Let me start with the barrier. Let's do that.
Yes.
The barrier, I think, I've been seeing for almost 9 months now. We had the big demonstrations all over the world. But what happened was people saw it as an incident. They saw these demonstrations, they saw the movement as an incident that popped up. Maybe we could put out a statement to show we're friendly towards it, because there are a lot of angry people out there. But what also happened is there was a lot of tone policing, which you also mentioned, Nick and Victoria, which means you get to speak on the terms of the institution. So you may talk about Black Lives Matter, but your word is, we preach diversity. It's not about what it means and what it entails. It's about what fits their schedule, what is possible to use for window dressing. It's not actually getting to the root of the problem. So my experience is that people didn't really reflect upon what Black Lives Matter meant for individuals, for institutions, for society, maybe even for the world. We only saw something which we knew would go into history. So the first reflects a lot of organizations, specifically higher education institutions, had, well, we have a lot of students, they were most likely out there. Let's put out a statement. Maybe an article, it will take up some days, but what was the follow-up? And that's the issue in the way we approach this. If you do not follow up in practice, in decolonizing your literature, in how you deal with racism and discrimination inside of your institution, if you keep pushing it to the edge of focus, you're not honoring it. You're just using it. You're exploiting a movement, a struggle, and you don't get to go from struggle to action. You tend to go from struggle to struggle to struggle.
And from reaction to reaction instead of action.
Yes.
And I think that's what you're also saying, that this kind of it's almost a knee-jerk reaction. Oh, we need to do something, and let's do this. And then, of course, the question is, but how it's not just about institutionalizing it, because institutionalizing might also be, organizing it and controlling it, and that's not what is meant here. Institutionalizing means the institution has to change to be able to really have this as a starting point, to have anti-racism at a starting point of how the higher education is organized. So it's not just literature. It's not just bodies, as in teachers or students and so on, but it's also your pedagogies, it's your epistemologies, it's the way you're open to all these various perspectives. What you, in your work, there's a reason why you built the table.
Yes.
Can you say a bit more about that? Because it's connected to very much this way.
It's connected to the mechanisms that I just prescribed. Usually when people think of an issue, they think I have to gain a seat at the table to discuss it and then I can fix it. But what often happens is people get a seat or take a seat at the table, but the table isn't built to work for them. They can pause by, they can have a drink, they can show up, make a picture with everyone at the table, but the table is not there to provide them of power, to put them in action, to put them in power. So what that means is not the people are the issue, the way we construct the table is the issue. And that's why I reshifted from a focus of we need to gain a seat at the table to no, the whole damn table needs to be rebuilt.
And then in that, how can that help to get rid of the barriers that are now still present in higher education, which is lethargy, but also there's a reluctance, or there's also fear of doing the wrong thing, and talking is at least a bit more familiar and feels like we're doing something, but then action, what does action mean? Because sometimes talking is also action. Especially we were talking about the safe spaces. We can talk. You can have very brave conversations in safe spaces. That could be a particular action. At the same time, there's something missing, and I would like to ask all of you later on. But first, you to say, building the table does pose a challenge to the institution that would help to get rid of some of these barriers. So, what barriers would you help to get rid of if you start building the table?
You mean institutions, higher education institutions?
Higher education institutions.
I think, first of all, the current structure in which students get to have a voice is not working. It's not really where the decisions are made. In Dutch, we have medezeggenschap, which in English is student participation, if I'm correct.
It's like the student council.
It's like the student council. But what we tend to do is in higher education, we say, you know what, we're going to build a committee. Students get to be a part if they're lucky. And then they can have a voice, vote on something. But it's very often not definitive. It's sometimes even not really in charge of the agenda on the topics which are discussed there. I think you should skip that whole system. I think you should just we have the board of administrators. I think that needs to have students in it. You need to start at the top. Why? If you don't have a seat at the top, then what's the point of having all of these tables in lower levels of the hierarchy? If the decisions are made there, then that's where a student needs to be. And of course, we're living in Dutch Western society. You need to get your education, but that's where the conversations need to happen on the terms of it has to have a follow-up.
Yeah. What you're actually saying is do not add a table, even though you may be able to build it. No. That table built by you, so student-led table building. Now this starts to sound more like a workshop, but that should actually be the center of power, but also should lead other processes. And actually what you're saying, because now getting away with the metaphors, but is actually to reverse the entire hierarchy. Students should be facilitated in that, because that would help also to open up the higher education system in the sense that also in terms of teaching, curricula, pedagogies, epistemologies, we are much more led by students than now is the case. I think you're doing a very interesting exercise with students in this regard. You're trying to open up that conversation with students from non-migrant backgrounds, and I really appreciate that, sort of reversing the exceptionalism. So could you say a bit more about how that ties into this broader conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. And I also see some issues there with not the idea of letting students participate in having a say, or an important say even. But my apprehension lies also maybe within the idea of the student body being like a whole. And there's a lot of diversity within, and I'm using the term diversity, within the student body. And that's actually what we're also exploring at Vrije Universiteit here in Amsterdam. Because starting from the Black Lives Matter moment in June, or May, June, I mean, we were one of these institutes that sent out, this great text. Actually, I really like the text.
One of the first.
Yeah, I think actually the first. I mean, not to brag, but... the diversity offers, I wasn't part of the text, but I thought it was just, I did think it was good. Also because in the text there was reflection on the history of the university itself and its own problematic history. In that sense, it's not just history, it's still ongoing, of course, in some ways. So yes, there was that. And then what happened, indeed? I mean, that's, I think, indeed the question to ask. So we do have, these courageous conversations going where students can now online come together, talk about a specific topic that the Diversity Office puts on the agenda. But what we noticed is that a lot of the same students come there. And with the same, I mean students who feel inclined to talk about these topics, who feel that they have a stake to talk about it, who feel that it might be about them or about a friend, or who in some way feel that this is about them. But there are also a lot of students, and I think these are the students that we have to also engage somehow, that might feel this discomfort that we were talking about, or this is not about me, or actually what can I say? We were talking about language, about words that you cannot use. And actually, I'm talking about, white students without a migration background who are part of the university, of course, but who sometimes feel either left out of this conversation or apprehensive about whether they have a say or they can have a say. So we did a survey in 2019. This was, of course, before everything happened that we now discuss. And what we found is actually that these students without a migration background, they are, we should really start focusing on them if we want to really do something also on an institutional level with changing the way, we organize things, who belongs, who feels excluded. And that was because of some of the results we got from the survey that showed us that actually this is a group that we shouldn't lose sight of when we talk about diversity. So we decided actually to interview them specifically on the topic of diversity at this university that is quite diverse in terms of ethnicity, in terms of religion. And, some of you have also mentioned this, that Vrije Universiteit also prides itself on its diversity, or diverse student body. I should be a little bit more specific, because in terms of staff, it's not that diverse. But there is this, indeed, risk of, what Sarah Ahmed has also described, that it just becomes something to, window dressing, that it's not nothing more than that, or little more than that. So we started interviewing students without a migration background to ask them, so how do you see diversity in this university? But also, what is your place in this discourse on diversity? What do you do, actually? Not to put them on the spot, but really to find out, do you do anything? Do you engage? Where do you come from? In what terms are you perhaps different? And how do you sometimes feel excluded, if at all? And I think this is really, it was really insightful, because it brought to light that there are people basically who say, well, it's all right. I don't really mind. It's, it's there, but, I have my friends, I have my group of friends, and actually they're quite homogeneous, but, I'm good. It's this neutral kind of thing that isn't neutral at all. And then you have a group of students that is really engaged and really, conscious, but you also have a group of students that is really, really, they feel excluded because of, ethnic diversity. And this is, I think, a group that we need to kind of reel in. So if you have these courageous conversations, if you have any, get together where you want students to connect, this is the group of students that are very, very hard to find and to feel a connection to.
And that they're also part of this collective process of making education inclusive. That is all our work.
Exactly.
And that if they would feel more invited, that they, because I think you both also said it's sort of this recycling of usual suspects. At the ISS we've seen it, and you also mentioned it. But that's what you want to break through also with these conversations. And I think you already inspired us. And Riciane, you'll hear about this, because we're going to do something very nice and hopefully cross-cutting all these differences at the Haagse Hogeschool and hopefully together also with the HVA. So again, watch this space. But this is something that really I thought was really inspiring, to open up this conversation multiple ways, because sometimes also people are shy, not just teachers, but also students, like, how do I engage, and how does this apply to me? Am I also involved? Because in the end, we're all different, right? And nobody fits labels. And I think we need to constantly remind ourselves that even if we might perceive a group as homogenous, they're not. And I think that if we all speak to these different hegemonic positions and oppressions that everyone experiences in different ways, although, yes, there are hierarchies and there are power dynamics at play that we, like whiteness is like racism and whiteness is something that we that's central in our work in anti-racist pedagogies. But then there are all these others that we need to connect, because they're all connected, as you also brilliantly analyze in your work on anti-racism. I would like to go to a question from the audience, because and I think this is something that all of you have encountered, is that if you're activist like, or if you're an activist, and I think, Nick, I would like to ask maybe this question to you, because you have sort of confusing hats on in that sense.
Yeah.
So you're an activist, and you've been part of building this movement, and at the same time you're a teacher, which sometimes sits a bit uneasy, at least that's in your words.
Definitely.
And please, could you, because this person would like to ask whether you could reflect on how are you then taken seriously? How does that teaching, activism, how does that merge? And is there a contradiction?
It's something. It starts with a fight in yourself. So I was always, as a student, I saw that we didn't talk about it, and we were not all responsible for the problem of racism. So that's what I really liked about what you said, is that we have a responsibility with each other. So, and when I finished my study, I worked as a project leader at SACI, and then I could, because we have the comfort of not being paid by the HVA, so we can say what we want, but also make the change within the HVA. So we work a lot with a lot of people, and so that balance is really nice for our work.
Because you're a part of the student for student program.
Students of Students program.
But that means that you're also still fighting for your institutional space.
True, yeah. So, that's great that you acknowledge that, because... okay, well, that's for another moment, because I want to answer
really
the question. And then I became a teacher, and then it was weird, because I was fighting battles in the institute, and then I was the institute because I was a teacher. So I was like, it was really what was the word that you used? Like the
contradiction.
Contradiction.
You were an embodied contradiction.
Yeah, I was an embodied contradiction, but I feel like because I did all the work, so also when we talk about institutionalized anti-racism and feeling responsible, because I had that kind of conversations for years, I could take that conversation within the class and talk about it with all my students, and do the knowledge that I learned from all these beautiful people that created SACI, I could put in my lessons. So also feel like it's sometimes double, because you can say everything, and if you say something, it's also about yourself. But I think that's also a point. It is about ourselves. It is about our role as teachers. How do we want to raise students? What do we want them to learn if they work with people? Do they understand the problems of those marginalized groups? Not to put them in as one whole group, but like there are certain problems with hierarchy and positions in society that they face. Do you know that, and can you knowledge that in the work that you do with all those people? Especially because I'm a teacher at social work. I mean, you will always come in contact with different people. So yes, it's sometimes hard because you don't know what to say, but it's also, I feel also like when you're on that table, even if you're not have built the table yet, to give that other voice, to say, to speak for students that don't feel comfortable speaking for themselves because they're fighting their own battles and studying at the same time. It also creates a moment of thinking with each other, and I think that's where where progression starts.
I think that's brilliant how you put that, because that actually means that there's a lot of learning and unlearning that also needs to happen between teachers, which actually where activism has a very crucial role. Yeah. And I would like to go back to you later on, because there's, but I first, Victoria and Edithiana, could you reflect a bit more on, from a student's perspective, what if a teacher is doubling activism and teaching? Is there such a thing as neutral teaching?
In my experience as a student, I do not think there is such a thing as neutral teaching.
Or objective. I think that's the word used here, yeah.
Because just before we came in here, we were having a conversation about objectivity and subjectivity. And if what we are discussing in class is my experience, is what you think is an objective reflection or expression of my subjective experience, then we need to really break the table and rebuild it, right? But I also see that, because I had teachers like that, right? And you could see them struggle as well, because it's a learning curve for everyone. There are no institutional structures that tell you what you can do, what your boundaries are, where you start, where you end, what you can say, what you cannot say. So it's also a struggle. And that in itself is a problem, right? But I had teachers who were both activist and teacher in the same sense. And I think what they did was to create safe spaces, not simulated spaces.
Yeah, that's a crucial difference.
Yeah.
And the only one that can say whether it's one or the other are students.
Yes.
So students should be much more, and I think that goes back to evaluation that you mentioned earlier. Really, how can we listen more? And I'm saying we as a teacher now here, so we need to always be clear if we say we, from which we speak. Teachers should be more attentive to what students, where they come from, what they need, and how you can create a community in that classroom or any other educational space that can actually really work for instead of against some of the power dynamics.
Yes.
Work against some of the power dynamics and work for the community
Yes.
at hand, so that you can actually have that learning together. Can you say something about how you see that activism and teaching, or?
The combination of activism and teaching actually for me portrays the whole purpose of teaching, because it's someone in a position holding a certain type of knowledge, but this person that is an activist and a teacher at once also says, I see you, whether that's me or someone else in his classroom, and I'm going to make a safe conversation for you to grow and learn. That's what I see when I see a teacher who is activistic, has activism, like Nick, for example, or you, most of the people at this table. But to be honest, I haven't come across this kind of teacher, but what I do know is that I've longed for this kind of teaching.
Mm-hmm. And then, Isminta, I wanted to ask you, because some colleagues of ours call themselves engaged scholars, and it's a debate, and especially with Black Lives Matter, this momentum in higher education and how to create a more institutional platform for anti-racist pedagogies. How would you position yourself in relation to that sort of question posed to us, like engaged scholars, engaged teachers?
That's a very difficult question, I think. Yeah.
You don't have to answer it, but just reflect.
No, I because it is also difficult. An important question. So I do want to reflect. Indeed, I might not have an answer.
No, but just first your thoughts.
I always feel like I'm the party pooper in that sense, but I do want to then go back to, so what if that activist teacher would be active in a way that is very uncomfortable for me? Because we talk about activism in a way that we appreciate it, but there's activism in many ways, and I think that's where it starts to kind of, become really difficult. So where do we draw, again, the boundaries? I love boundaries in a way of, putting them out there, because they are there. We always draw these boundaries. We were talking about it as well. And where do you draw it? And to what end? And what does it mean? And as such, to be engaged, I think, is to acknowledge we all are. And that's, I think, what we have to, as teachers, have to admit that neutrality or objectivity is, how can you ever be? I mean, and that doesn't just go for the social sciences, it goes for everybody in every field. Yes. You
Math,
bring your own
STEM, all STEM, yeah, definitely.
You never leave yourself, at the outside when you go in. No. So I think that's step one for teachers to do, to acknowledge that we all have our convictions, our preferences, our dislikes as well. And then how to handle that in the classroom, because I think, you don't have to, I wouldn't want to ask teachers to lay it all bare, but to at least reflect on it and to also be aware that sometimes that makes you, maybe even unfair in some situations towards different students. And just to reflect on it and to sometimes also go back to it, because I think that this is also where we maybe have the option to open up. Not to say you cannot do any wrong, because people will, step on toes, say the wrong words, use the wrong vocabulary. But if you are able to reflect and actually come back to what you did, sometimes publicly. I know of an incident at the university where a teacher said something really stupid, horrible, and he sent an email to all his students on that same evening after having apparently had feedback and reflected, and he apologized. And I think that might be some of the, the answer that you can get for, do you have to be an activist? Do you have to acknowledge? Well, sometimes you do have to acknowledge that you were simply wrong or you did something out of the, out of bounds, so to speak. But yeah, we cannot all be engaged scholars in the sense that we are all, on an equal level of, self-reflexive and stuff like that. But to make room to make mistakes and to actually come back to that. And that as a teacher, I think we also have to give a little bit of credit, because there are these enormous power differences, but that also plays sometimes against the teacher, because you think you have to be all-knowing, you have to always do it right, you can never make a mistake, but we do.
Especially online, when we're faced with all these blocked cameras. And no, and what I maybe can add to that, I think teaching is then the first, and activism may be your position, maybe a political position and your engagement. But I think when you're a teacher, the first priority is to have that educational conversation in the classroom, by also being honest and transparent about where you come from, but without imposing it. And I think that is the space that we need, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So there's another question, which is a difficult question probably to answer, but it's like a sort of a question about curing racism. So it is a very, very broad question, but it's about, if people know the right thing, would they also be able to do the right thing? And then I think this would... And I think this ties, so I would like to, that's a question from the audience. The other question that I would like to tie to that, and that makes it maybe a bit easier to narrow it a bit, is what is the one thing that you would advise your higher education institution to do right now to make sure that they not only know the right thing, but also do the right thing? So I hope I combined these questions good in one. And actually, sorry, Victoria, you're on.
Okay. First, I would say that we should begin from the premise of accountability. Secondly, I would say that we need to transcend the academic rite of passage that sees or that stakes the recognition of southern epistemologies on northern gatekeepers. Thirdly, Black students shouldn't sit in class as poster kids for all that is wrong with the world. That is not objectivity. That's a one-sided story that perpetuates and deepens racism, whether we like it or not. So institutions need to begin an audit on their teaching and learning styles, on their curriculums, right? Because even, or going beyond what the Black child sitting in class feels is also the perception of the other children sitting like, there goes illegal migration and senseless wars, We've gotten those looks, and not that they say it in those ways, but some of my friends would tell me, this is what I thought, the one-sided story, right? Racism is a virus, almost like a biological virus, and its features evolve. It might become something that we may not be able to handle. So now we need to begin in institutions having meaningful discourse on racism and on how to dismantle some of the institutional racism that is perpetuated through our reading materials.
Audit on anti-racist pedagogies.
Yes.
Be accountable to students.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a great way to start, because then we cannot dilute it, we cannot divert it, we cannot just talk.
Yes.
But we need to act. Nick.
Yes, I think there needs to change. I think there are more ways. I think one of the ways that's maybe good to say because you just asked about it. I think that Stacey, where I work at, those two women, Matia Wunu and Semea Boulalou, they have a legacy. For me, they have a legacy.
Good to name them.
Yeah, good to name them. They have a legacy of 8 years fighting without getting money, but to mobilize all the students and to talk about what they want to see, what they want to hear. And I feel that kind of teachers and organizations has to be institutionalized. That spaces that specifically zoom in on the first generation students of colors, students that mostly feel excluded. What do they need? Because when the people that are fighting those fights leave, what's left there? It can be only incidents for me. So that's one thing. And I also feel that, so I said just like, no, Stacey won't, but I feel we have conversations and now we heard that we can go for 6 months longer. So that's nice, but it's still 2022. So, and then we have to see if we can extend further. And it's not that that Stacey has to stay, but there has to stay spaces where those people can come to, because we have been a space where people come to when they have situations with teachers, when they felt like some subjects weren't discussed in the class. And I think that kind of organization that can give that back are important to have in an organization. So, yeah.
Okay, so from accountability to students, student-led spaces committed and supported by the institution to keep the institution on its toes when it comes to raising, because the blind spots need to be pointed out, worked on constantly, and that needs to be facilitated within the institution.
Yeah, and I think that's also, it goes with what you said. I think that the experience of the students has to be the lead of the intention and what people will do to create a better and safer and more learning space for all students. Yeah,
exactly. So I would like to ask you.
I think it's very important for specifically my institution to give a follow-up to statements they make. Because what happens is they frame things as an incident instead of a structural thing. They give a statement and they expect it to, slip off the edge of focus. My institution in specific needs to learn and unlearn how to be respectful in statements and how to create a follow-up which is up towards the standards of the students, because at the end staff, of course, because staff and students both experience things that aren't desired. But what I think is very important, it should be on the terms of the people that feel it needs to be there, not on terms of the budget. And yes, everything costs money, but a budget is always very small. It needs to target the problem. It needs to honor the wish and desire of people that have been asking and longing for it for too long. And it needs to be structural. It may not be something for 6 months. And yes, everything goes with a 6-month trial, but we should not see these things as a trial.
No.
It's a structural problem, so it needs structural answers.
Yeah.
They're fundamental.
Fundamental.
So they need fundamental commitment and not these short-term sort of. And then what you're saying needs to be embedded throughout.
Yes.
It needs to be mainstreamed. But therefore, you also need to have these audits and then these spaces to keep it on the mainstream agenda. Thank you so much, Sminthe.
Brilliant answers. So little to add. The only thing that I might add is that when we did our research on belonging among students at Vrije Universiteit, what became really apparent is that there is a long way to go in terms of where can you actually go when you experience discrimination, racism, exclusion. So on top of this whole more structural indeed aspect of not the 6 months budget, but, make this a core business aspect of your institution. I think that we really have an opportunity to make far more visible, what are means of support within the institution when you do encounter, and people do encounter racism, discrimination, exclusion. Where can you actually go as a student or a staff? And how do we make this not just visible, but as also core business of the university to provide, shelter, to provide safety, so that, I just envision every new student, every new employee, you get a leaflet and you get all these names and numbers and, email addresses on where to go when this happens to you. And I think it's a really easy way of...
Like a grievance procedure, but then specific for
but
this.
really specific and also... Who are the persons that you can go to? Either within your department or your faculty or on a university level. And it's simply missing. And I'm guessing that my university is not the only university where this is missing.
Please, Nick.
Yeah, and I think also is that what I hear a lot is that the fact that I don't know if it's happening, and then as an institute you will see that it's happening, and then the power lies with what you do to it. And now to not... they don't acknowledge it because it's not a place where they can go to. And I feel like for a lot of students, they can talk to each other. They can talk with the teachers that they feel safe to, that are those double roles. But it's also good to know for the institutions themselves, like what are the situations? How is it? Sorry.
I agree.
No, sorry. Last thing, because we have to indeed close. And I'm so sorry, because this conversation can go on for a long time. Ritiana, last bit.
What I would like to add up, the moment a student makes a step to go to a counselor, he or she or them expects something. And what's also missing in our system in higher education is that the person, they can tell their story in private, doesn't necessarily have a power role inside of the institution. So yes, we should know where to go, but the person we go to should also be able to do something.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right.
Absolutely right. Yeah.
I think that goes back to the accountability. It needs to have a complete, it needs to be ingrained in the entire system. We can go on for hours, and I look forward to do that. But our guests online, please, thank you so much. And everything will be on the website, and links will be shared with you to look back on all these sessions. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you also for the Hague University of Applied Sciences, especially the Global and Inclusive Learning Center of Expertise that I'm part of, the Ministry of Education, Science and Culture, and of course, ECHO, Expertisecentrum for Diversity Policy, for organizing this seminar. Hope you will join us for the next ECHO seminar by the end of this year in collaboration with the Diversity Office of the Erasmus University Rotterdam. So that's nearby. We're going to go there, right? At least as guests.
Yeah,
this conversation is not yet over, and we look forward to many more. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah.